Amy Walter, the CEO of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. It's welcome to our leadership series. You're on like the real TV, the Meet the Presses and all. This is closer to Wayne's World, but we're very happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
I'm really excited to get the invitation. Your guest list is impressive. So I'm actually thanking you for this opportunity.
Well, let's not spend the whole 45 minutes thanking each other, but as you can see, we're at 145 and climbing here. Interest was off the charts. Your reputation precedes you, your political punditry royalty, which is something which is very cool. Something as I was thinking about what I wanted to kind of walk through and talk with you about is that I sort of know this Amy Walter, but I don't know kind of where you came from. And as I think about, my brother, for example, I mean, he was into politics and campaigns and elections in middle school. He had this crazy board game where I used to cheat and he used to win. It's before computers. But give us your backstory. Like when did you get into this business before you became this Amy Walter?
I appreciate that question because I didn't have that background. Politics wasn't something that was part of my interests when I was growing up. I mean, my parents were voters, but they were not obsessed with politics in the way that I am. One thing that I find really interesting for those of us who do this kind of work in the analysis space is many of us had parents who were in mixed political marriages. So my mom was a Kennedy Catholic, and my dad was a Protestant Reagan lover. And the two of them canceled each other's vote out every year, but it made for a really interesting experience for me as someone who, by the way, I'm also a Libra. So my job is always, I got to make sure the scales are balanced. I don't like things getting too far this way or too far that way. So I think I kind of came by it rightly in growing up in that sort of environment. Plus, Bruce, you and I grew up in a very different era from what we're living through, right? It wasn't that strange to be living with somebody who had different political affiliation or married to someone with a different political affiliation. Now, isn't that, I can't remember who did that poll, but it's been cited so much, I don't even want to look for it because it's probably somewhat of an urban myth. But the number of parents who say probably the worst thing their child could do is marry someone of a different party versus somebody who's of a different religion or a different race. So I think that has also sort of really impacted the way that I look at politics from growing up, not just with those parents, but in that era in the 80s and 90s. I came to Washington in early 90s, and it was fortuitous. I think so many of us who work in Washington have one of these experiences. You come here and something happens or someone happens, and that changes the course of your life. And for me, I was working at a group called the Women's Campaign Fund, and its job was to elect more women to office. And it just happened to be 1991. And I literally got here about 2 weeks before the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings. And I remember really distinctly, as soon as that hearing began, and watching, for those folks on the call who may be a little bit younger, it was a panel of all men, all white men, looking down at Anita Hill from the dais. Of course, then Senator Joe Biden being the chair of that committee. But it really sparked something among women voters, and women candidates. You had a record number of women running in 1992. And that was my first experience with politics was, oh my gosh, wow, we elected more women in 1992 than it had ever been elected. It's like, oh, this politics thing is kind of fun. Look what you can, look what you can do. And I ended up working for one of those new members, Marjorie Margolis-Mezvinsky, in 93. And then, like a lot of people in Washington, I kind of bounced around trying to figure out what I wanted to do, work on the Hill for a little bit, worked on the campaign, went to a trade association, right? Kind of did all the things. Nothing was really speaking to me. And then I met this guy named Charlie Cook, who said, hey, listen, I have this opening. Would you like to come and cover house races for me? And this is in 1998. And I thought, all right, I'm in. Why not give it a shot? And those old enough to remember, in the late 90s, before really the internet took off, everything we did was printed. So you would get the Cook Political Report in a thick gray booklet. And it's where I learned really so much about campaigns and politics. But that was where I actually found my real love for politics, was interviewing these candidates.
So let me ask you about that then, because, Cook Political Report, you're right, is a storied franchise, both then and now. When I got to town, like that was the read. And of course, in the beginning, there was Charlie.
Right.
At this point, there's Jessica, who does a great job in the Senate. Dave Wasserman is, has the best Twitter follow, I think, on all Twitter. He's the best political follow. He's got this crazy army of groupies, who've seen enough, which is awesomely weird. It's a little bit like the Vulcan salute people at the Star Trek conferences, but he's awesome. You're great. Give us, if you would, a little bit of how it started, how it's going, and where it's going, because in particular, you made the point, you're right, it started before the internet. We're now amidst crazy social media, and things are getting, is the future of the Cook Political Report Chat GPT? Or talk to us about how it started and where you are.
I know. Well, it started with the concept, as most things do, which is, how can people whose job it is to follow campaigns and elections, who invest in campaigns and elections, get analysis or nonpartisan, sort of like a consumer report of campaigns? Because at that time, if you were invested, engaged in politics, a trade association, a PAC, an association, corporation, the information you were getting was really from the campaign committees or the candidates themselves, or your best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother who knows some guy who talked to somebody in Pennsylvania who said, hey, this is a great candidate, you got to invest. And here was Charlie saying, look, I know something about politics, and we're going to be out here talking to both sides and give you our assessment of what we think is happening, what's realistic in terms of competitive districts, states, and what's not. And over the years, you're right, things have changed a lot. Obviously, we do stuff on the internet now. We don't print out a big booklet that drops on your front step. There are a lot more people in this space now covering politics. I mean, Bruce, when you and I first started, if you were a young person trying to get involved in journalism, the only place really to be in Washington was either roll call or the hotline, right? Everything else was, if you wanted to really cover politics, you stayed back in your state, either that you grew up in or maybe you went to college to. Now, the zone is being flooded by it seems like a new publication every day that covers Washington politics. But I think what makes us different and separates us, one, because we've been around, it's almost 40 years, if you can believe it, that the Cook Political Report has been around. We know what our lane is, and we're very comfortable with that. We cover campaigns and elections. We're not trying to be something that we're not. And we've kept very much focused on that. And moving with the times as well. It's not just that we're out on the internet at a time when that's where people get their information, but understanding the changing electorate, campaigns, talking to as many people now who have been around for 40 years as people who are newly starting out in the business, right? As the new young campaign managers, or it's getting harder and harder, Bruce, to meet candidates now because almost all of them are younger than I am. And I remember the time when the first one I met was my age, thinking, wow, that's crazy. This person could be in Congress. They're my same age. Now it's like, oh, everybody's 20 years younger than I am, it feels like.
Thank God for President Biden.
Right.
Well, so Look, it's I think dollar for dollar, the subscription I have to Cook Political Report is the best spend I make to stay abreast and to be aware of what's happening in politics. Although fascinatingly, one of the things you guys offer that isn't behind the paywall are the, as simple as it is, the toss up, the lean,
That's right.
following those and a lot of the information. Everybody ought to check out your website. It's, again, if you have any interest in politics, it's a pretty affordable subscription, but just the information there alone, and everybody should be following at Recount.
Right. At Redisc.
At Redist. I'm sorry. Right. Yes.
Because Dave, like your brother, was one of these kids growing up who was obsessed about politics and was drawing congressional maps in probably middle school. So he loves redistricting, drawing, map drawing time is his time to shine. But you're right, you can go onto the site and for free see our ratings. But if you click on one of those states or districts, this is what your subscription gets you. And it is like, for what people pay for, especially in this town, it's incredibly affordable. And then you can get all the information about that race, who's running, talk about the district, what some of the dynamics are there. So, so thank you, Bruce, for that, because building that site also is, as anybody who has a site knows, it's a time-consuming process trying to figure out how best to, how to make that experience really good for people, and intuitive. So that's that.
So I want to return to Cook Report in a bit, but the people came for the politics, and we need to give the people what they want. Yeah. So let's start with the midterms that we just had. Where Republicans picked up the House. Democrats lost the House, but they beat the spread. What history suggested would have happened, what the polling had all of us Republicans convinced was about to happen, then didn't happen. I'm interested in your takeaway or takeaways, and you've written a decent amount about this that I thought was well done, but let's presume everybody here hasn't read all of your pieces like I have. Explain 2022 midterms.
I think that what you had in 2022, there are two ways to look at it, or you're right, there are many ways to look at it, but I'll put it in these categories. One, we're so used to elections, especially midterm elections, being national, right? If the party is suffering in Florida, it means they're also going to do poorly in North Carolina and every other competitive state. Instead, this was a more regionalized election, where if you were watching election night and all I gave you was the Florida returns, which is what we all first saw, right? Because Florida not only closes early for those of us on the East Coast, but they report pretty quickly too. When those numbers started coming in, whoa, that suggested that this was going to be an absolute thumping of Democrats. But around that same time, so as you're watching this going, oh, okay, this is now maybe looking really bad for Democrats. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Then in comes New Hampshire, also a state that is obviously it's on the East Coast, reports pretty early. And there you see Maggie Hassan leading easily, right? It doesn't even look close in that state. And so it was sort of a whiplash back and forth going between Florida and New Hampshire, in part because in the places where the issues like abortion rights were literally on the ballot, or where it was a topic, very important topic in that state. So Michigan is another good example of that. You saw Democrats do much better than would have been expected. The other thing, of course, was the quality of the candidates. This is especially true on the Senate side, with the candidates that came forward out of those primaries, endorsed in many cases by Donald Trump, just didn't fit the swing state model very well, right? They were candidates who could have done fine in a red state or even a pink state, but not in a purple state, like Pennsylvania or Georgia or Arizona, right? And I also think we have to give some credit to Democrats themselves, which was they got a big boost by the environment, specifically the Dobbs decision, also by Donald Trump being on the scene, both literally and figuratively, with January 6th hearings, and then he was on the campaign trail for his candidate. But those Democrats raised a ton of money. I mean, when I sometimes forget it, and you go back in the FEC reports and you see, Mark Kelly with like $90 million, right? This is a sum of money that is just unbelievable. Raphael Warnock, right? Almost $100 million. And they spent it early on defining themselves. And they built up a brand that I think really stood up to the attacks later on. And the attacks were really just trying to attach them to Biden or attach them to the poor economy. But it didn't work as well because I think voters, instead of making this decision between, do I like Biden? Do I not? Do I like the economy? Do I not? They said, yeah, I'm not so crazy about Biden. Don't think the economy is doing well, but it feels riskier for me to pick this candidate over here on the Republican side than to stick with the status quo. So I think that is at really at its core what happened. And the House side as well. Bruce, if you said to me, listen, I in say October, I don't have any other information than this. Republicans are going to win the popular vote by about 3 points. I'd say, oh, okay, well, that's probably Democrats pick up about, Republicans pick up about 20 seats. Well, the reality was that many of the competitive House races were taking place in the states where there were also competitive Senate races, like Arizona. The places that Democrats did the worst, or Michigan, the places that Democrats did the worst were in places where there weren't competitive or as competitive top of the ticket races, like California. And then in New York, it got started pretty late, that race there. And I don't think that Democrats were as engaged. The one interesting thing, Bruce, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about, though, is we talk about the advantage Republicans had with the environment, the advantage they had in terms of turnout. As I said, they turned out at a high, more people voted for Republicans than Democrats by 3 points at the national level. But I'm also wondering if it's the kind of Republicans that turned out that we have to be really focused on, because part of what we saw in 2020, we looked at the polling and it said, oh boy, Joe Biden, he's going to win by a landslide. Look at these polls. He's winning. He's either tied or up in all kinds of places, including Ohio and Iowa, places we thought were off the map for Democrats. But what I think was happening, and we've heard this from pollsters after that election, as they've done more sort of digging into that, into what happened in that election, at least from the polling perspective, is that it was picking up people who identified as Republicans, but they weren't Trump Republicans. And so there's something about a midterm year where those folks who are real strong, like Trump-centric voters, may not turn out, but they do show up when Trump's on the ballot. Now, do they show up if Trump's not on the ballot in 2024? I don't know. That's a very good question. But I do think that this electorate, while it was more Republican, I don't think it was necessarily more Trumpy than it was, say, in 2020.
Well, and look, proof of that. I mean, you pointed out New Hampshire on election night, Chris Sununu stomped. So it's not like the voters were going in who were, dyed-in-the-wool Democrats would never vote for Republicans. You could look at the DeWine Vance differential in Ohio. I think that's a great point, and the data seem to bear it out.
Yeah, and that for Democrats who are feeling really empowered by the results of the election in 2022, I think just being a little wary of, okay, remember the kinds of Republicans who may have come to the polls and voted for your Democrat, right? These were the people who also might have shown up and voted for Joe Biden or skipped the 2020 election because they couldn't stand Trump, but they also couldn't vote for a Democrat. So, the makeup of the electorate is the hardest thing to understand and always appreciate. But I think that, look, Democrats did something that is really hard to do with the help, as I said, of the Dobbs decision and of Trump himself, but they turned a midterm election from a referendum to a choice. And the last time we saw that work was 1998, with Democrats really making the 1998 election about impeachment and sort of a backlash to that impeachment. But Bill Clinton had a 60% approval rating in 1998. The economy was rocking in 1998. Those two things obviously weren't happening in 2022. So to face those headwinds and to still come out ahead is a pretty impressive feat.
No, I agree. That's a great analogy. To me, in 98, the voters were saying to the Republicans, dude, don't screw this up.
Right.
And in 2022, they were saying, like, dude, don't screw this up, because there's so much more that's stressful. So let's turn to 2024. It's, the old line is that the sequel is never as good as the original. It at the moment is sure feeling like we're drifting to to Rocky versus Apollo, Rocky 2, but without any of the enjoyment of that movie. Let's start on the D side. Am I crazy? I think President Biden is clearly running. Yeah. And it sure feels like they're going to just clear the field for him. And unless something, fate, some big external event takes a hand, this is going to be an uncontested 4 more years chanting convention. Do you see that the same?
Yeah, I agree with you that you don't see anybody right now really positioning themselves to challenge Joe Biden. Now, would they have, had it been a less successful midterm election? Maybe, but I still think that the challenge that Democrats have comes down to the fact that, one, there's no obvious successor. There's not one person you say, well, it would be great if we could just get this person to run, everything will be fixed. The second is this existential fear of Donald Trump and Donald Trump winning, and that the one person who knows how to beat him is Joe Biden. And so let's put that up again. And the risk, we know, Bruce, of an incumbent president that gets challenged, right? It divides the party, it saps energy, all of those things. They don't want to make Biden look weak, so they don't have much of a choice. If you're sort of a Democratic establishment figure, you feel like, I don't really have much of a choice. Now, should he decide not to run? Now we're talking, that's even more, that's even a more hard to figure out scenario, because you look at history and you say, well, sitting vice presidents do really, really well. It's hard to deny a sitting vice president the nomination, except we now live in a very different era than we did back in, the pre 21st century. Lots of folks coming into this with name ID, right? That's usually why you did well as a vice president, because people knew who you were. Nobody knew who a senator from a state was, or a governor from another state. Now, look on the Republican side. People all over the country knows who Ron DeSantis is. People on the Democratic side know who Gretchen Whitmer is, right? They've become national figures. So they start at a different place than your traditional, again, in the old days, some other kinds of candidate would start. But I'm under the impression that, yes, Biden announces, he doesn't get challenged, and Democrats decide amongst themselves that basically the bigger risk is a messy primary than having an 80-year-old run for re-election.
Yeah, that's the way I see it too. It will be interesting if there's a recession or otherwise. The poll numbers haven't popped big, and the idea that only he can beat Donald Trump, I sometimes wonder if it's very 2020. But let's turn to the far more, I think the word is interesting, side of things. Trump is back. He's back in the pool, baby. And once again, there's a third of the party base that would vote for him, even if he shot somebody, I guess now on the beach at Mar-a-Lago is instead of on Fifth Avenue, which means 2/3 of the party is ready to move on to somebody who seems more likely to win. The challenge is the 2/3 that would like somebody else aren't behind a candidate. They're going to potentially divide. I've seen this movie
I know.
and you wake up in a sweat, and, and then you realize it wasn't a movie. How does 2024's Republican primary not simply replay 2016, or does it?
I feel like it's very different. And again, no two primaries are alike, and we have to be careful, right? Apples, oranges, et cetera. But this feels to me a little bit more like 2008, where Hillary Clinton was the far and away favorite, but it was pretty clear, even early on, even in 2006, that she had some softness there, right? There are people who are like, yeah, Hillary, she's good, but like, yeah, I'm kind of looking around the corners. There's somebody else. And here comes this Barack Obama, and he has a national following, again, thanks to the fact that he had that speech in 2004 at the convention. He has a pretty impressive outing, when he goes on the Sunday shows. Everybody kind of knows who he is. And it looks at first a little bit rocky, like could he possibly make this work? But the other reason I draw the parallel there is that there were other pretty significant candidates in the race. Obviously, Joe Biden was in there, and you had Chris Dodd, and you had John Edwards, right? So these weren't like CD tier kind of candidates. These were real candidates, but they never got any traction. It became a two-person race right after Iowa, and it stayed a two-person race. Now, you're right that it's different because the Republican primary is winner take all, not proportional. So yes, you don't have to divide it all that much to be able to still, win by a little bit and come out with all of the delegates. But that said, I do think, and again, looking at the polling right now, where DeSantis starts is in a much better spot than you're sort of really than any other Republican candidate, but even better than any other quote unquote hot candidates. For those who haven't seen the Nate Cohn piece from the other day in the New York Times, I thought that was a really smart way to look at it, which is, all of us know the hot candidates from previous eras: Scott Walker, Tim Pawlenty, Rudy Giuliani, right? They were all going to be the nominees. And some of them didn't do so well, but DeSantis starts out at a place more like where again, in a previous era, a sitting vice president might start, just in terms of his name ID, his favorability, and his position in the polling. So I think he's a significant player in this, and I think he has the potential to just sort of blot out all those other candidates who are going to struggle to figure out, what is their angle in this. And if DeSantis is, look, I give you everything that Trump does, but I'm younger. I have, a track record in Florida. Obviously, not only am I going to win Florida, but look, I can take this track record and sell it anywhere. You're not going to have to worry about me tweeting things, being undisciplined. So look, I'm the newer model, right? You can turn in the old.
All of the great anti-woke taste and none of the crazy calories.
There you go. That's a good way to say that. And yet, Bruce, as we know, we got to see what this looks like in real life. On paper, it looks it's a very compelling argument. In real life, sometimes that doesn't work out so well, right? Rudy Giuliani being the prime example of that, somebody who was really well known, really well liked, and then just never got much traction. But I don't think that's where DeSantis is gonna end up. But we've got to see how he performs.
So today the announcement was Nikki Haley, who,
right?
Interestingly, DeSantis, I agree, has done a brilliant job positioning. He's got a machine in Florida and all, but he doesn't. The big question mark on him is he boring? Can he be a candidate that gets people fired up? That's why the comparisons with Scott Walker. Nikki Haley has, in terms of just political skills, she's a generational talent. The question I wonder is, okay, but kind of coming from where, and what's the base, and
right.
Where do you go?
What's her if what DeSantis is selling is, and Haley actually, both are selling the new generation, right? Not very subtle way to be like, it's not just Joe Biden that's old, okay? That guy who used to be in the White House, he's not so young either. So making that generational pitch, making an electability pitch, right? Ron DeSantis can say, I've been elected twice. Florida, it used to be a competitive state. I crushed it. But he's also new because he's not part of like the Washington old system, or maybe a better way of saying it is Haley is still connected in many ways to the Trump era, obviously serving in the Trump administration. And she's had this sort of, right, she was this kind of candidate here, and is she this kind of candidate over here? And is she with him? Is she against him? Is she, what is her, what is the pitch? Maybe the better way of saying it's not just what is the pitch, but is it the pitch that voters want? And I think, going back to 2016, the thing I remember the most, Bruce, about primary voters that year is you would talk to Republican primary voters and you'd say, so you're thinking about Trump, huh? I mean, do you think he can win? I mean, this guy, he's never done anything like this before, and he's pretty controversial. And they'd go, you know what? I don't know, but I'm really sick and tired of the kinds of candidates that we've had to deal with before, right? Like everybody told us, I know John McCain may not be your cup of tea, but he's the only guy that can win. They told us the same thing about Mitt Romney, but he's the only one that can win. Well, guess what? Right? We keep losing. So what's the risk? So we vote for him. He loses. Big deal. We keep losing with these other people. Why not give this guy a shot? That is where they were then. Now it seems like they're in a place of, we don't want to lose. So we definitely, winning being a bigger piece of this. And at the same time, though, we also don't want a kind of establishment candidate to do that, right? We like what Trump has to offer in the sense that he's they still see him as an outsider, right? Even though he was president, he's still the outsider president. He's still fighting against the establishment. So can Haley be anti-establishment at the same time that, to your point, she has all the credentials of someone who was part of the traditional establishment?
So let me ask on that, Amy, because I think that's a great observation. A lot of that reflects the fact that we're in a more populist period than in a long time, in decades. And there were flashes of it and hints of it in Ross Perot, hints of it on the right, at least with Pat Buchanan. But to what do you attribute this extraordinary high level of populism that does animate it? It's why Bernie was seemingly on his way to pull off a Trump in 2020 before the entire Democratic establishment, broke the glass, pushed the big red button and said, it's Biden, period, full stop. What do you think has been driving the populism, and where do you see it going?
What's so interesting, Bruce, is that I think there's some of it is a populism thing, but it's more of an anti-establishment and anti-institutional fervor. And depending on what side of the aisle you're on or how you identify, where that anger and ire is going looks really different. Now, if you look at Gallup, they've been asking this question for almost 50 years now about which institutions do you trust the most. Not surprisingly, I think we all know this, most institutions you've seen the faith drop off pretty consistently. But then if you look at what do Republicans, what are their top institutions they trust, Democrats, there's overlap in two things. Small business, they both have high, which we can argue whether small business is an institution in the same way that like the police are, but whatever. All right, so small business and the military both get the highest marks from both Democrats and Republicans. But then look at number 2 for Republicans, the police, 67%, not surprisingly, not very high on Democrats' list at 28%. The presidency this last year was the third most trusted among Democrats. I think a big reason for that, of course, was what they saw from the Trump presidency. So 51% faith in the institution of the presidency. Among Republicans, it's 2%. And then you see it on public education, the medical system, right? With, the big gap in, it's not just that trust in those institutions has fallen, but the big gap between what Republicans think institutions are, still relevant or worthy of holding on to, and those that aren't. So that's where I think so much of our fighting comes from, right? I mean, if you fundamentally believe, as Republicans do, that police are one of the few institutions in which you believe in, and then you have the other side that less than a third believe that to be the case, that is a hot, right? That we know we're going to get the clash right there, and so when you put Democrats who say yes, if we're going to call them anti-institutionalists, they're much more on, as I said, whether it's the police or whether it's organized religion, they're going to be much less interested in supporting that than they are, say, public schools. What happens too, which I find interesting, is the idea of like, well, what does populism really mean, right? And we know that if you sort of take a literal translation about people having more power and taking it away from the elites, in some ways, this is already happening, right? The internet did that quite brilliantly. You don't have one media source anymore, two media sources. Now you have a billion media sources. Anybody can be a YouTuber, anybody can be an expert. Campaign fundraising, the parties are weaker than ever because they don't control the flow of money anymore. Some of it is true, comes from super PACs and billionaires, but a lot of it comes from people all around the country who are writing $20 checks, and $20 checks start to add up in the case of Bernie Sanders. So I think it's already playing, it's playing a pretty significant role in the way that our politics is working. And yet the deepening frustration, and to me, this has always been kind of interesting, is you get politicians who say that they're running against the system, they're part of the system, and then trying to reform a system within that is always going to upset people, right? Nobody's going to ever feel as if somebody on the inside can be as good of a reformer as somebody on the outside. The final thing is, I think Democrats and Republicans have a fundamentally different, it's always been the case, but fundamentally different idea of what the job of government should be right now, or what the role of institutions. And Democrats want to see government work. They want to see more government. They want to see more active government. Republicans, obviously, they've been more willing to take outsiders as their candidates because they think that the people who are in government are really the ones who are screwing it all up.
Why that, when you think about why all voters seem to be so much more anti-institution, anti-establishment, you're right. The three possibilities are: first, governments just become bad at everything, which I don't actually think is fair, whether you look at Operation Warp Speed or the military assistance to Ukraine. There's a variety of things one can point to where government's actually been successful, but people don't buy into it. Number two, it could be because now everybody knows everything. And so nothing is secret and no one is sacred because of the internet. And in particular, institutions are shown for their hypocrisy or biases. And so, Democrats are less likely to trust police, in part because, Democrats are far more a party of people of color and who aren't treated equally at the hands too often of police. Likewise, Republicans don't trust the mainstream media because they watch and they say, well, this isn't close to objective. The Hunter Biden story was factual. It gets buried. The third possibility is because the media isn't actually although this is not true of you guys, but the media, for the most part, the mainstream media, isn't in the business of trying to be objective. They're in the business of getting you to click, letting you to watch. Outrage does that more often, kind of things that make you mad or and kind of scratch your one of your itch, your desire to be affirmed. How much of this is the result of we're in an era where the media is a business, it's entertainment, and so it's built to drive all of the sense that the other side is not the loyal opposition, but rather they're a threat to your way of life?
Yeah, and the nationalization of our media, I think, has been the biggest change in all of this. I mean, Bruce, when I started off, and I loved covering the House, in part because you learned a lot about the country that way, right? And these members would come in, they're identified with a party, but look, somebody in rural Mississippi, I remember these two candidates back to back. One, Democrat, rural Mississippi, Ronnie Schaus. He was the roads commissioner in rural Mississippi. And his whole message was, I'm going to Washington to get more money, to build more roads, to get my people in my district from the rural areas to Jackson. And then 5 minutes later, I meet David Wu, who was a candidate running in Portland, Oregon. It's all about high tech. It's all about the trade with the Pacific, right? I mean, they just had incredibly different priorities based on what mattered in their very unique districts. Now you run on, I'm running against Donald Trump. I'm running against the woke. I'm running against Obamacare. I'm running, right? So it is national first and then local. And the news that people get now is almost all nationalized, right? Maybe you're checking in, what's going on in your community, but it's not driving the conversation. What's driving the conversation, to your point, is, what's the stuff that's getting the buzz, right? What is the most outrageous thing that happened today? And whether you're watching cable or not, you're getting it on Facebook, you're getting it through all these other sources. I mean, I have a 16-year-old, and just watching his media consumption is, first of all, I don't know that he still understands that there are things that are called live programming that they're just happening now, and that's just like new to him. This concept, everything's on demand for this generation, and people that he listens to as experts. Right now, I have no idea who they are, and they're experts on whatever video gaming or whatever else, but they have like millions of followers, right? I mean, you're getting more followers with a YouTube site than some of these mainstream outlets are getting eyeballs.
No, that's totally true. So I got two last questions for you. I
Yeah.
always try to end at about 45 minutes. First is just on reforms. I mean, I'm a history nerd, and I think a lot of what we're living through now is reminiscent of the Gilded Age, which was followed by sort of a progressive era of reforms, which included political systemic reforms, direct election of senators, women's suffrage. There's somebody here in the audience, Greg Orman, who had run for both senator and governor as an independent in the state of Kansas. And one of the more thoughtful guys on reform actually had him as a co-guest, talking a little bit about the Final Five effort, which is a combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting. There's also some redistricting reform. When you look at the landscape as a nonpartisan objective observer, do you see any reforms you think would make a meaningful difference?
You and I are on the same wavelength here, because I look to that same era, the frustration with, it wasn't just with government, but also with big business, right? Monopolies. So it was a populist progressivism that made those big changes. But I mean, Bruce, do you think that anything could possibly make it through an amendment process in this day and age? Absolutely not, right? It's just, you have to take that off the table. I can't imagine something being able, even if something that we think is the most popular thing ever.
Term limits would. I don't think it's a good policy, but if you put it in front of voters.
All right, that's fair. That's fair. Okay.
I got one in.
You got one in. So I'm going to have to go state by state. I think the biggest challenge right now for those reforms is among Republicans. The idea of ranked choice voting still seems like something that only helps Democrats. Republicans believe that it is only going to hurt their chances at winning in key races. And until Republicans believe that ranked choice voting is better for their political chances, it's hard to get it through.
All right. So last, there's so much more, but we always want to leave them wanting more. You guys gave me a pretty cool mug when we had lunch, the Cook Political Report mug, which it says "Drink from the source" on it. Yeah, I didn't bring it. It's in the office, and I'm not.
It's okay. Yeah. Look,
Perfect. There we go. Oh, there you
lovely,
go. Yep. So
microwavable, dishwasher safe.
I'm
all
hoping that the business plan, I know we have Catherine here, but isn't mug sales. I think what you
No,
guys
no.
have is
We're gonna
higher
have,
value add. I'm
like-
just interested in, I know you've got a few initiatives you're doing now. Like what can we expect over the next 2 years from you guys besides the best, thoughtful, smart political analysis?
Well, thank you for that. We're trying to, as you said, really focus so much on the analysis and the specifics, because we're once again in an era in 2024, the likelihood where we have yet another flip Senate and House, and of course the presidential race. But in terms of providing, especially for folks who maybe work in the corporate space or work in the trade association space, who need to kind of understand, like, well, what's really happening out there, not from a partisan perspective, not even from a policy perspective, but appreciating just the likelihood as we're sitting here and we're moving, we're talking a lot about, and I write a lot about, Bruce, the stuff that we talked about here, doing more video and more interaction with our editors one-on-one. We have, for folks who are interested, David Wasserman, our House editor guru of all things House redistricting, has a briefing for subscribers on March 2nd. We do these briefings pretty regularly, where it's not just that we tell you what we're thinking, but we take questions from folks who are interested in their own specific questions or races. And so being able to have that kind of relationship between subscriber and editor is the kind of thing that we'll be doing more of. And thanks to Zoom, it makes it a little bit easier. It was exhausting to try to do that in the old days. Remember that, Bruce? You had to show up somewhere and try to get everybody's schedule aligned, who's in town and how do we do this and do we have to feed them? We still love doing some things in person, but we can do a lot too by having these sorts of conversations.
Well, I appreciate your joining us for our conversation. Amy Walter, great work with the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. We look forward to, I look forward to reading all the things I get as a subscriber, but hopefully others will follow you as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce.